So we started today in the planning session with Dr. Lauren McPhillips from Penn State. So I think she gave a great overview, presentation, and discussion on planning for climate change. So she started by walking through the general approach where MS4 generally focuses on the smaller storms. Dr. McPhillips referred to those as more of the nuisance events. And that what that means or is defined varies across the country. So I think most areas do look at that 1 inch event, so which is usually about a 1 year or maybe a little smaller event in most areas, but there are a few areas of the country that are looking at some of the smaller events, and she cited Phoenix. Arizona is one of the areas that's looking at a much larger event because they do have those really intense, quick storms that they try to treat. And then she gave a summary of climate change, so particularly in Pennsylvania, where it's predicted that we'll see about an 11.5% increase in annual precipitation and a 16.3% in the max 3-day precipitation events. And so that does provide a little bit of a challenge, or at least in how we plan for treating these events and implementing the BMPs that we put in. So she also walked through some of the different BMP types and showed that green stormwater infrastructure generally provides the greatest resilience to climate change. So they're very adaptable. They provide a number of different functions that work well in what we anticipate being the impacts of our changing climate. So they're multifunctional. They're utilize different scales. There's some redundancy in them and diversity as we're implementing the projects. And then she made an interesting note that they're oftentimes safe to fail, which is a little bit of an odd perception, particularly for a civil engineer like me, that we could be allowed to fail, or systems will be allowed to fail. Is a little bit hard to wrap my head around, but I think she did make a good point. And I think as part of the redundancy, if one system or one element of a system fails, there is some redundancy from a series of green stormwater infrastructure practices. And so looking at those things, again, mentioned a lot of the social and ecosystem services, and then talked about some of the planning. So she gave a couple of examples, one in planning for cloudbursts in New York City, but then also in general climate change. So the question was asked, what's cloudburst versus more of a climate resilience plan? And Dr. McPhillips made the point that a cloudburst is one of the effects that we're expecting to see and beginning to see from the changing climate. So that it's cloudbursts and planning for those is an element of a plan for providing greater resiliency to climate change. And so that was generally that. And then just thinking about changing climates, a couple of other side effects or other potential impacts is of one example Dr. McPhillips gave is that if we start to see more snow, then we're going to need more salt on our roads, which means we'll have more salt going into these BMPs. And so that's something that we need to plan for.
Jason, you muted yourself.
Well, that was a fun trick. Not sure how I did that. Okay. So I think the last part was a little bit about the issue with road salt. So as we change our climate change, we see more precipitation, which in Pennsylvania generally means more snow. Then that means more salt on the roads. So we would need to mitigate for that. So just that wrapped up that discussion. The next presentation was from John Levitsky, who talked a little bit about retrofitting a basin for vegetation. So discussion of the specific example was from a school where there was an existing basin on the school property, and he's able to come in and retrofit by adding vegetation to that system, and discussed a number of the benefits of adding and upgrading it was a flood reduction basin, but adding vegetation to those systems. And so the vegetation provides a number of benefits, including reducing the temperature of the stormwater. So by providing some shade in the basin, reduces the temperature, which is important to some of the adjacent streams that are popular trout habitat. So we just walked through a number of the challenges to that, particularly dealing with some of the perceptions of the school system and the maintenance. So most people associate wetlands with mosquitoes and snakes, but the wetlands also bring in predators. They bring in frogs, dragonflies. So in his experience, he's not seen much of an increase in mosquitoes. So it doesn't mean that they're not present, but they're not typically a nuisance because of the predators that come in. And then I said at this point, they're 3 years from having vegetated the system. They have not really seen any issues with snakes, and the frog populations are thriving. So there's some connection to the basin, but also to some of the surrounding wetlands. And so I think he said it took about 1.5 years from beginning the planning to where they approached the school to be actually implementing and planting the vegetation. And so there's no signage on these sites yet, but there is a plan to bring in the school to provide some extra benefits from the potential for outdoor classrooms. And he is hoping to get some credit for that. And then we had a discussion on some of the extra benefits of these systems in general. So we know about the environmental benefits, so it's improving water quality, specifically talking about reducing temperature, but then also some of the other ecosystem benefits with bringing back some of the habitat. And again, reducing the temperature of the runoff improves the habitat for some of the adjacent trout streams, particularly some of the brown trout, which provides some economic benefit as well from bringing in some of the folks who like to use some of these areas for fishing. So a great discussion on just some of the benefits just from planting or adding some vegetation to some of these basins. And then the last talk that we all just heard was about what to expect during an audit. So two things I took away was one, no surprise inspections. So hopefully that helps provide some comfort. They're not going to not show up on your doorstep unannounced, so you will have time to prepare. And then document. So we definitely something that we heard to take away from verbal agreements are not sufficient. Then we do need some documentation for those, and to have that documentation handy. So when they come, they want to see the program that you're meeting those and following those 6 minimum measures, and that's been documented. So have your file cabinet ready and handy to be able to reach back and access that documentation when you start looking into your program as far as how you've implemented inspections, how you're involving the public, how you're implementing the illicit discharge detection and elimination programs, the O&M for the BMPs, and the other elements of those minimum measures. And then again, the focus on this at this point is generally on cooperating and education to make sure everyone understands and has a quality stormwater program. So that's what I learned from the 3 sessions I moderated.
All right, thank you. Any other updates? Any other sessions?
I can jump in. This is Kelly. I was only on the schedule for one today. And so the one that I heard was this morning with Dr. Reike and Dr. Zimmerman. And they are from the Clean Water Institute at Lycoming College. And unlike Jason, I don't have every aspect of their presentation memorized, but I will say it is one worth going to see, because the cool thing about this presentation was that it identified barriers that small MS4s often identify with when it comes to saying, you know, they have challenges implementing their MS4 stormwater program. And what was really great about this particular study that was done using foundation grant monies was the barriers were identified, and then through their research, very research-based process, they were able to bust through the myths about why these MS4s might be saying, you know, we can't implement stormwater programs or different aspects of them. So I'll give you a taste of some of the things that they highlighted in their presentation. The idea that, you know, it's all agricultural input coming from upstream, and that has a bigger impact on water quality than our MS4 discharge. So they were able to use research-based findings, just bust through that myth. The idea that, investment isn't going to benefit us here locally because it's all about taking care of, the downstream watershed. And so the presenters really focused on the importance of using local benefits and honing in on those local benefits that will resonate with stakeholders to show why the MS4 program actually will benefit, local attributes within the community, things they may care about, whether it's recreation or, just their local water quality benefits. Talking about the need for interdepartmental coordination and how important that can be, and that can really help a program be implemented more effectively and efficiently. They did report that in their research, they were not able to find any MS4 that went bankrupt as a result of implementing their MS4 stormwater program. So that's good news for small and large communities. The research pointed to the fact that, sure, some communities may have had issues with combined sewer overflows and those types of, the wastewater treatment plant investments. But when it comes to MS4 program implementation, no MS4 has gone bankrupt. And really the focus of all of this was to really understand your MS4, your community, and tailor your program to very specific factors. And one of those really important factors to think about is the financial fitness of your MS4, and making sure that you tailor your program to meet the needs and the things that your community is concerned about. But I highly recommend that you take a look at this presentation once the links are available, because for every barrier they identified, they were able to provide research-based, essentially myth-busting. And I think that would be very instructive for MS4s who may identify with some of those challenges to see how they can overcome them. So that was a great presentation, and that's all I have to share.
And Jennifer, this is Barry Tonning. I had 2 sessions this morning to report on. The first one was delivered by Robin DeYoung and Jamie Pizziali of EPA, and it gave a pretty good overview of EPA's 2012 Integrated Planning Framework, which is a framework for integrating wastewater and stormwater planning. It's also fairly expansive. It can include considerations like climate change, putting together multiple MS4s in a watershed under one plan, and so forth. And this was a framework developed by EPA that was driven by some U.S. mayors' desire to consolidate planning for their various Clean Water Act programs, wastewater treatment plants, stormwater, flooding, and so forth. The approach is voluntary approach to long-term planning that can include green infrastructure, the conventional capital projects that municipalities are involved in, flooding, wastewater treatment plant issues, operation and capacity, sustainability, resilience, quality of life are also a focus. There are some guidance documents available on EPA's website. EPA worked with state and local governments to develop the framework, and it was included in the 2019 Water Infrastructure Improvement Act. There are about 30 MS4s that have developed plans so far, with I think a dozen or so included portions at least of their plan in their MS4 permits or their consent decrees or administrative orders. The Environmental Finance Center has some technical assistance available for integrated planning, and they can help municipalities out with cost comparisons, various configurations of an integrated approach, and so forth. It's a free phone call for consultation until August 31st. I think that program will be operating. We also heard a case study on that from Richmond, Virginia, which integrated stormwater, wastewater, and CSO plans, and included the Chesapeake Bay TMDL nutrient loads, sediment, and bacteria considerations in their plan. And one of the findings from the various communities that have adopted this process is that having a third-party facilitator, especially if you have large stakeholder groups, multiple parties, and if there are trust issues and so forth, bringing in a third party to help sort through things can really help build participation and trust and support for an integrated approach. The Richmond integrated permit aggregated their wastewater treatment plant operations, the MS4 stormwater considerations, combined sewer overflow planning, and the waste load allocations on the Chesapeake Bay TMDL. They found that it reduced reporting redundancy, increased flexibility, focused their funding and their activities on their highest priorities. And another result was they exceeded their targets for land conservation by 9 times and their targets for stream restoration projects by 6 times. EPA is supporting local demonstration projects to build capacity and has a local ombudsman now to help local communities with their planning. Jamie Pizziale, and as I mentioned, there's a website with lots of resources for MS4s. The second session I moderated was the stream restoration project in Montour County. A health service provider, Geisinger, worked with state and local partners to stabilize eroding stream banks bordering their property to improve secular run. This is a small stream that starts out in an agricultural area and runs through this more municipal area. And the landowner provided some of the assistance. The project was funded using programs that are normally used for ag BMPs. This was one of many projects completed by the North Central Stream Partnership, which has been operating since 2007. They help with grant acquisition, providing technical and other assistance, buying materials in bulk, and so forth. They have mostly worked in ag areas, but there are cases where they can work in municipal areas. They traditionally work with conservation districts to engage landowners, and they can help out with permitting. DEP provides funding for some of these projects via the Growing Greener grant program. And for this project, the Fish and Boat Commission was involved, providing technical assistance, design assistance, and construction oversight. DCNR funded some buffer plantings. There's a fairly significant stakeholder group with multiple goals, as is typical in a project like this, but there was a cooperative and coordinated approach that incorporated water quality, recreational considerations, sediment reductions, and habitat goals. The reach that was restored was a badly eroding reach in a mowed and landscaped area at a site. It was a previous industrial complex, but now it's a medical facility. The project involved grading the banks, installing log and rock structures for tow protection and habitat, some rock veins. There's a pollinator strip planted along the stream buffer. The costs were covered by Growing Greener, and I should mention that the applications for new projects for Growing Greener are due in 2 weeks, I think it was said. The Geisinger Healthcare group provided their building and ground staff to help out with the project. I think they did most of the planting. The county master gardener did some oversight of the planting and the pollinator strip. DNR provided funding for some of the plantings, and Geisinger helped match all of that with their labor and other materials. And they did all this under a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers general permit, which is an expedited way to do small stream reaches, shorter stream reaches. They started the planning in January 2020, and by May of last year, they were completing construction. So a very accelerated schedule on a very interesting project. And that's all I had.
Great, thanks, Barry. Those were great summaries. Thank you, everybody. Are there any more, were there any parking lot issues from any of the sessions that we need to address? All right. Seeing none, I can go ahead and say thank you all for your participation today, and thank you to our presenters. We really appreciate your time and your efforts. A reminder to please fill out the survey and give us some information about your experience. And we will talk to you again tomorrow. All right, have a wonderful afternoon.